they would become the dominant force in the economy, right? And finally, the oil spigot, right? You know, there's no gainsaying the fact that Iraq was the last frontier for a huge expansion of oil production in the Middle East, right? After 25 years of not fully developing the oil, right now the idea is that Iraq, which produces a little under 2.5 million barrels per day, will ultimately produce 13.5 million barrels per day and solve for perhaps as long as 15 years the energy crisis of the world. Right? So that was not inconsequential, and you know, we saw all sorts of signs of it in the early days of the war. The only places that were protected in all of Iraq from looting were the oil facilities, for example. Now, I think what's important to realize is what Ashley brushed over in just a couple of sentences when he said the U.S. has experienced 3 defeats. The intervention in Iraq has been a defeat. It's been a military, political, economic defeat for the United States. And we have to keep that in mind because, and you know, if you go over these five goals, hegemony in the Middle East, they've strengthened Iran, right? You know, among other things, right? A military hub, they're struggling to maintain this presence. And they haven't stopped trying to maintain this presence, but Iraq keeps saying we're not only going to throw the military out, but we're going to even throw the contractors out. Right? And they keep saying they're going to do it, and the U.S. keeps trying to say we're not going to let you do it, and we will see what will happen. A strong ally. If this is a strong ally, boy, you know, I'd like to see a weak one. I mean, you know, they've talked over and over again of getting rid of Maliki, but they can't find anyone else they think is more reliable. They don't have anything. It's very much like Vietnam after 2 or 3 coups, right? When they knew they didn't have anyone left, right? Open the economy. Well, you see, there's a half measure here. They succeeded in destroying the Iraqi economy. And by the way, it wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate. 1 month into the Bremer regime, they shut down 192 government-owned enterprises in Iraq that constituted 35% of the Iraqi economy. And with a multiplier effect, within 6 months, it created 60% unemployment in the country. So they were very good at destroying the existing economy, but they haven't been able to build their neoliberal economy. And as a matter of fact, after a few years, the Iraqi government has started to try to rebuild their state-owned economy there. Right? And this is another point of the struggle. And then there's the oil spigot. Before the war in Iraq, Iraq pumped 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. For the next 5 years, it averaged under 2.0 million barrels per day. The entire period of official American full-time presence resulted in a 25% decline in production. And all of the efforts, and let me tell you, the efforts were huge for the U.S. to try to deliver the oil over to the international oil companies, to increase production in all sorts of various ways, to open up new oil fields, to have exploration, to find even more new oil fields, and they know they're there. They just don't know where they are yet. All this has been a complete failure. Everything. And it wasn't until a year before last, when Maliki had established himself as the de facto ruler, that any motion took place towards expanding oil production in Iraq. And this was the letting out of 11 important oil contracts to international oil companies, which you would imagine would be, you know, well, at least we won on the big kahuna here. Okay? Only there were 2 ways in which even that was very much of a compromise of U.S. goals. Number 1 was that the contracts that were let were not what's called production sharing contracts, which would have delivered to international oil companies complete control over oil production for 20 to 30 years, and they can make all the decisions, including the most critical decision, which is the level of production. If the international oil companies have control over the level of production in Iraq, OPEC is gone, right? Which is, of course, a secondary goal of this whole policy, was to break OPEC, because then Iraq, if it really had that $13.5 million capacity would have been able to completely violate the rules of any agreed upon rules of OPEC, because the oil companies themselves would make that decision. These are technical service contracts in which technically, and I say that with great emphasis, technically the Iraqi government will make the production level decisions. It's asking the oil companies to develop them, but they're going to be under the thrall of the Iraqi government, or that's the plan. And this is what I want to spend some time on in a second. The other element of this is that of the 18 or so oil companies involved in these 11 important oil contracts, all but 3 of them are national oil companies rather than international privately owned oil companies. So the big oil, multinational oil companies, the ones that, are always referred to, Shell, Exxon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they are partners in 2 of the contracts. The principal partners are national oil companies, most notably the Chinese oil companies. Right? The 2 major Chinese oil companies are the major holders of these contracts. And they are animated, they're very capitalist countries, but they're animated by very different dynamics than the international oil companies. So even on this point, the United States suffered from a major setback. Now, what is going on in Iraq right now, and this is what I want to spend a little bit of time on, is that the struggle is going on, and it continues to go on, over whether the United States is going to be able to sustain that overarching goal that it started with, which the Obama administration has not abandoned for a moment. Even while he was running for president, Obama said, oh, we have to emerge victorious in Iraq. I think we can do it by changing the strategy. That was what he said. Right? And of course, he didn't really change the strategy because Bush had already decided to sign on to this agreement to withdraw the troops, right, and discontinue the surge, which was not victorious, but which was creating the largest period of bloodletting. And the whole period of that war, when there was huge amount of bloodletting, the greatest bloodletting was during the surge, not because of it, not after not before the surge. And the surge was abandoned, right, in much the same way that all these initiatives in Afghanistan are being abandoned. But they, they were told many times, why don't you just declare victory, right? They declared victory. But they changed their whole strategy, and then Obama continued. But let's look at what's going on right now, and I think there's a lot going on. And one of the things that Ashley didn't mention that really should be emphasized is when these huge protests were sweeping through North Africa, they swept into Iraq.
Yep,
Iraq had what was called the Day of Rage, and I want to read you the very kind of unschooled coverage of the Associated Press on a little bit of this. So, after mentioning that there are large numbers of protests, they say on Friday, this is the Day of Rage, thousands marched on government buildings and clashed with security forces in cities across Iraq in an outpouring of anger, the largest and most violent anti-government protests in the country since political unrest began spreading in the Arab world. Now what's interesting about this is that, of course, they just have to say, and most violent. All the violence was government violence. It was very much like Egypt, right? The protests billed as a day of rage were fueled by anger over corruption, chronic unemployment, shoddy public services from the Shiite-dominated government. Demonstrations continued on Saturday in the northern city of Sulaymaniyah, 160 miles northeast of Baghdad, where nearly 4,000 demonstrators took to the streets. Some protesters threw rocks at Kurdish security forces. This is in the Kurdish areas, which are, always advertised in the American media as the peaceful areas, the prosperous areas, the highly developing areas, right? The ones that are only being restrained by the fact that the rest of Iraq is so dysfunctional, right? Huge demonstrations there. At least one person was shot and killed and 3 injured, said the head of Sulaymaniyah health director. So, in the Kurdish areas. Now, this protest, like the protests, for example, in Egypt, did not start from a standing start. They've been going on right along for the last 2 years. All different kinds of protests, all different kinds of resistance in Iraq, to the ongoing effort by the United States to impose that same original set of policies on Iraq that initiated the war. And the resistance emerged at every level of Iraqi society. One very brief comment that I think is very symptomatic of this. So now they've got these international oil companies who are supposed to be coming in and developing the oil system. And there's a huge conflict that's going on around us. Okay? And the conflict is over whether or not the oil companies will come in, really get control of this, and put it to the service not only of themselves, but to the broader effort to open the economy to multinational investment. Okay. This is about a smallish oil field, right? That was let out during those 11 contracts. The Akkas oil field in Anbar province near the Syrian border was awarded October 20th to a South Korean and Kazakh oil company. South Korean National Oil Company, the Kazakh National Oil Company. They have a consortium with others in it, including an Iraqi oil, nationally owned. But mistrust of the central government has caused local officials to balk at the deal amidst fears, and this is what the crucial moment in this is from the Iraq Oil Report, which is a very reliable, business-oriented, but nevertheless good reporting. Amidst fears that produced gas won't benefit the province, which lacks electricity industry and development, the contract has yet to be approved in even draft form. Right? Now, why hasn't it been approved? Because inside the oil ministry, there's a tremendous amount of resistance to the possibility, perhaps probability, that these oil contracts are going to end up allowing international oil companies to come in to the country, to get control of oil production, to bring their own employees, including their unskilled employees. Keep in mind that we're talking about a country that has had, one of the most skilled oil engineering cadre in the world. Most of them had left during the U.S. occupation, but also a highly unionized oil workers. And all of them are afraid that what's going to happen is that the entire control of this oil establishment, which of course is the only source of oil for the government and for the building of the country, right, will be simply taken over by international oil companies. Jobs for locals will be gone. Contracts for local subcontractors will be gone. The technicians, the Iraqi technicians, will not be working in the foreign technicians, right? And one of the signs of how this resistance has percolated through the system is that the Iraq Oil Report reported 2 days ago that the international oil companies are complaining that their people can't get visas to come into Iraq. And when you read about, well, why aren't they getting the visas, it turns out that the Iraqi government has enunciated a policy that they're not going to grant any visas to any foreign workers who are unskilled. And as a way of guaranteeing that these companies have to hire Iraqis to work on these contracts. But also, into the bargain, without saying it was a policy, they're refusing to give visas to technicians and executives with the obvious intention that if you hire Iraqis, then you'll be able to get started. So the resistance that centered originally through the unions is percolated all the way up through the oil ministry into the political ministry. The local governments are on board with this resistance. So the resistance to the development of the oil industry is very much located throughout the society. People are very aware of what's at stake, and they are fighting it along. And that piece is exactly the same and is articulated through the rest of that American ambition. Despite every effort and pressure of the U.S. to say, we've got to keep 50,000 troops there, Maliki keeps saying, no, they've got to be out by the end of the year. We don't know how that's going to play out, right? But it's a struggle there. It's a struggle with multinational investment, whether Iraq should revive its national economy through government investment in, for example, the electrical industry, which is a complete mess, versus the U.S. policy, which is bring in international electrical corporations in order to control, dominate, and develop those areas. At every level, the struggle is being carried out, and I think as observers and as participants in an anti-war campaign, we have to understand that the Iraqi war is continuing. It's continuing in a different way. It's still a matter of U.S. imperialism. It's still a matter that the government of the United States is fully committed to its original set of goals, which is hegemony over the whole region and the use of Iraq as the key hub for American political, economic,